Let's pray together. God, thank you for today, and thank you for bringing us together as this little subset of our church community. We ask that you'd be with us during this hour as we continue this conversation about the process by which you brought your scriptures to us. We ask that this would be edifying for us, that it would help shape us, and that it would reflect honestly what you want us to know from your words. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Here we got another person coming in. So again, I'm going to do a little bit of an encapsulated review here that helps us kind of get to where we're headed tonight. I promise we're going to look at some actual Bible tonight. That'll be a switch for us from the first 4 weeks. There are all kinds of ways and views of understanding what the Bible is and how we're meant to use it in our life and faith and ministry. And for me, that story that I've told now at the beginning of each one of these classes has been this idea that a parent communicating love to an infant is a very good analogy for how the words of the Bible are meant to communicate God's truth to us. So in this class, we're talking about the history of the Bible, and we're doing it to deepen our understanding of how the Bible came to us. And we're also trying to deepen our understanding of how God speaks to us through those words. And so, as always, we'll review a few stats in the beginning. There are 66 books of the Bible, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. The Old Testament is mostly written in Hebrew, although there's an exception there's a Greek Old Testament. But I think one thing that I haven't said in the past few classes is that the Old Testament, whether it's written in Hebrew or Greek, comes from a Hebrew mindset, which is different from a Greek mindset. And I thought I'd pause just a little bit as we're doing the review and talk about what that means. Hebrews thought in terms of word pictures. Hebrew language is written in terms of descriptive, circular word pictures. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that, but I think that's the important thing for us to understand, because that's very distinct from Greek, which is, like English, very linear. And so the Old Testament is written in these pictures. It's a lot of poetry, as we're going to see later on in this hour. And but there are two different cultural ways of communicating represented in our Bible. Two dominant ones. One is Hebrew and one is Greek. Testament is just another way to say covenant. We Christians believe that there are covenants and an overriding covenant that governs the Old Testament, and that there is a different one, not a contradictory one, but a new one that is established in the life and ministry of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. New Testament's been around in its present form since about 120, the year 120. I say that all the time because I hear, even in the last week, somebody told me, well, I read in Dan Brown that the Bible didn't, the Bible had all this intrigue to how it was put together. And now these books were largely agreed upon. There may have been a few fringy variations based on regions. Remember, no internet, no printing press, no way of communicating. When they called a council to gather together the leaders of a church, it took a year to get the council going, because people had to get the letter, make their plans, travel however many countries across to get to Constantinople or Alexandria or any of the places where these big councils were held. And so this is a different time, but for the most part, our Bible was largely set by the early part of the 2nd century, about the year 120. And so we're back in the Old Testament. We're going to be here for a little while. We've talked about, I just want to review just in a few sentences each, the major things we've talked about. And before I do that, can I ask, in the invitation, did you see the little button you could click on for terms? Some terms and concepts. That that's just to point you in the right direction. And so, but we're going to review just a little bit what we've done over the last 4 weeks. We've talked about how the earliest scriptures were passed down from generation to generation by memorization and recitation. In other words, it's an oral tradition. Parents would teach the scriptures to their kids, and they would memorize them. And then they would pass them to their kids. But in between, they would say them on a regular basis. The whole process of transmitting these stories that became our Old Testament were passed down by oral tradition from generation to generation. In exile, and I've done a lot of the background of the exile, so I'm just going to say in exile, the people of God started to write these stories down more thoroughly, making sure that the words of God would survive over the years and over the disruption of being taken away from their homeland. We've talked about how the stories of the Old Testament had parallel stories in other texts. There is a flood story in the Gilgamesh epic that is an awful lot like our flood story in Genesis. And there is a long stretch of wisdom in Gilgamesh that looks almost verse for verse like a section of Ecclesiastes. And so the Bible isn't disconnected from other communities. It is it has influence both in and takes influence from the surrounding culture. And just a technical thing, we took some time to learn the Hebrew names for the scriptures. The Torah is the law, and the Nevi'im is the prophets, and the Ketuvim is the writings, and that the first letter of each of those become an acronym that Hebrew people use to describe the whole Bible, which is the Tanakh, T-N-K, and then with some added vowels in between. Because as we said last time, there were no vowels in ancient Hebrew. You think other languages are hard to learn. There's no vowels. I mean, most of our sense of who God is from the very beginning is written in a language that looks like little sevens and has no vowels. And so Hebrew is a pretty challenging language to learn. But the Tanakh is the name, the Hebrew name for the scriptures. And we talked about the different sources for the Hebrew Bible, how scrolls from different regions were edited together to make sure that the whole story gets told. And as I said before, we talked about the Septuagint, the Greek writing of the Old Testament, Greek translation of the Old Testament after Alexander imposed Greek on the whole Western world. And so, and that's important because that's the Old Testament that a lot of Jesus' contemporaries would have known. They may have heard Hebrew in the synagogue, but oftentimes, if they talked about the scriptures themselves, they would quote the Septuagint. They would quote the Greek Bible. Paul, in his New Testament letters, oftentimes when he strings together some Old Testament passages to make his argument, he's using the Septuagint. And so sometimes if you look, there's a footnote down at the bottom that tells you what Old Testament passage it is. And if you look at it, they're not the same. It's the Septuagint version of that Hebrew passage in Greek. And so all kinds of little technical things that way. We spent time talking about the two temples because those end up being important for understanding the New Testament. The first one, built by Solomon, was destroyed in 586 BC when the southern kingdom was taken into exile. The second temple was built when the people of God were allowed to come back from exile, from Babylon. And that's the temple that is in Jerusalem when Jesus came. And the reason they're important is that there are different worship practices attached to each temple. And Second Temple Judaism is the background, it's the foundation for understanding the Judaism that Jesus was born into. Talked about the Masoretic text, which was a group of scholars in between the 7th and 10th centuries AD who worked to put together the most accurate texts of the Hebrew Bible. and they added the vowels. Thank goodness. They added the vowels, and they also wrote down what they argued were the standard pronunciations for biblical Hebrew words. Can you imagine? For 1,000 years, there was no consensus about how to pronounce these words. And the Masoretes, over a couple of hundred years, put the vowels in and made footnotes and marginal notes to describe how those words were meant to be pronounced in Hebrew. It's worth reminding you again that the Hebrew having no vowels, that may just sound like an odd thing, but just imagine that in English. I think the word that I used when we talked about that the first time was, let's say you had the letters in English TRCK. Now, you would have to be able to make an argument from the context of the passage, right? From the setting or the sentence that it's in, whether it was trick or track or truck. And each one of those leading to a very different sentence, I would imagine. And so that's what the Masoretes did with the entire Old Testament. It's an amazing achievement. Again, no computers, no nothing. It was finished, and there were still 500 years to go before the printing press came. And then last week, we talked about the different groups within Judaism in the first century, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who we see in the New Testament. We see the Zealots a little bit. I don't know that there are very many, if any, biblical mentions of the Sicarii, but those are the scary people. Those were the assassins that were the Zealots who just murdered Romans and anybody who collaborated with Romans sort of secretly by keeping a dagger under their cloak. And that's where we get the phrase cloak and dagger. I mentioned last week that in Latin America, within the drug trade, they still refer to assassins or hitmen as sicario. And somebody told me they had just read that word in the news. It was banned in the previous week. It's one thing, you learn a new word and then all of a sudden you hear it a couple of times. And then the other group, the one that was important for last week, was the Essenes, this group of deeply faithful, deeply committed people who lived out in the wilderness, out in the desert, in caves, but who preserved some of what turned out to be the oldest manuscripts of Old Testament books. A complete copy of Isaiah, and actually parts of every Old Testament book except for Esther. And some scholars think that because Esther married a Persian king, that she was banished from the Old Testament by the Essenes. I don't know if that's true or not, but it makes for a good story. You'll remember that part. And then I think the main point for us to remember from the Dead Sea Scrolls is that Bible translation is a constant search for older texts. We don't have any of the original texts. What archaeology does for us is tries to find older texts than the ones we have now, to make sure that the copy we got and that we base our English Bibles on is the most accurate possible copy. So Jen and I were looking at a web page for the Gospel of John, and it had this tiny little fragment that was a fragment of 2 verses from chapter 21. And it's the oldest fragment of a New Testament text that exists. And it dates to about the year 125 or 150 or so. The oldest complete New Testament text with all the books present and all in their entirety is in the British Library. It's called Codex Sinaiticus, and it has all the books, and it dates from about the year 395, so the end of the 4th century. That's just some stuff you ought to know. We look for old manuscripts because they make our contemporary translations of the Bible more accurate and more trustworthy as we try and see what God was really saying in those original manuscripts. And so tonight we're going to turn a little bit to the content of the Old Testament. The different kinds of writings that make up the 39 books. And I think that learning about the different kinds of literature helps us read them better the way that they were intended. And maybe more importantly, it helps us avoid the error of reading them in a way that they were not intended. And we'll have some concrete examples of that tonight. Now, I've used this analogy before, but I was always going to do it again when we got to this part. I used to teach this class with a fresh copy of the LA Times with me. And the LA Times back then, before people stopped reading newspapers and they trimmed it down by about half, and before the internet, had 5 or 6 distinct sections to it. It had the front page, and it had what was called Metro, which was regional LA news. It had a business section, it had a sports section, it had an entertainment section, and it had classifieds. And I used to lay those sections out, pin them up so that people could see them. And then we would talk about the kinds of writing that you would find in each one of those sections. So world news and big events are in the front page, and then local things that might have happened with the LA City Council were in the Metro section. The business section back then, would talk about mergers and things. And back then you had to read the paper a day late to find out how your stocks did. Those were the days. The sports section obviously would have sport things in it. Entertainment would have reviews of movies and records, and the ballet and the opera and movie times. And then the classifieds would have things that people were selling or where they were having a garage sale, or my favorite, there were always puppies that you could buy in the classified section of the LA Times. All of those were familiar forms of writing to us. And we knew, when we picked up the entire newspaper, we knew which section to go to for a particular kind of information. We also knew that it would be foolish to go to the wrong section and try and find the information that we wanted. So you're never going to get sports scores in the classifieds. You're never going to be able to find where to buy a puppy on the front page. And so on. If you want movie times, you got to go to the entertainment section, not to the local news section. And so that makes this ideal, I think, a lot less threatening, that the Bible has different kinds of literature and you go to them for some information and not for others. The Bible is, it's a thousands-year-old document, and it takes a little bit of practice to read it well. And part of that practice is knowing which kind of literature you're reading, what that literature is meant to teach you, and what it's not meant to teach you. So I'm going to put up a slide, and we'll look through this. This is a breakdown of the Bible, and it has the sections as right here as the Jews name them, and then here as Christians and as English-speaking Christians name them. And so, and over here on the left is the Hebrew names of the books. Now, here's an interesting thing. The first 5 books of the Bible in the original don't have names. They're named after the first line. And so Genesis is called in the beginning, which actually ends up in Greek, in the beginning is Genesis. And then these are the names, and he called, and in the wilderness, and these are the words, is how Deuteronomy starts. Our Jewish friends call this the Torah, as we've already talked about. We call this the Pentateuch, which just means 5 books. It's the first 5 books of the Bible. And we also refer to it as the law, as Jews do. So the books are the same. They're ordered the same way. This is a fairly traditional set of charts that I was using. And so the dates concerned are from the very beginning to 1406 BC. Those are the years that are encompassed in the writings here in the first 5 books of the Bible. And when we say the law, this is where God establishes his covenants, the first covenants, And also, especially if you read a passage out of Leviticus, as we'll look at in a little bit, you see the very specific ways that these words teach the people how to do certain things. And yes, Leviticus is filled with all kinds of, if you do this, then this is what's going to happen to you. And some of those are just sound awful to our ears. For those passages, I point you to Pete Enns and that book that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks, The Bible Tells Me So. So the first section of the Old Testament is the law. And then this is where the order begins to, it doesn't really diverge, they just name them something different. Our Jewish brothers and sisters will refer to the former prophets. Those things we refer to as histories. And then they have the latter prophets, and then they will have a body of work that are the writings, and hold those all together. This is important because for Jews, many of these would be on scrolls. And so this is the order of the scrolls. That some of the smaller prophets, we actually refer to minor prophets down here. I'll tell you that in a second. Those are the shorter ones. And sometimes multiple copies, multiple prophets would be on the same scroll. So let me just go through here more quickly on this column, the words that we use for these books. We talk about the law or the Pentateuch. We talk about the histories. These, if you look up here, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, these will tell the stories of Israel wandering in the wilderness and finding its place in the Holy Land. You'll see in Samuel and Kings and Chronicles sometimes parallel, sometimes overlapping stories of the kings of the divided kingdoms that we've talked about before. After Solomon's kids couldn't hold it together and there was a split between North and South, there are these stories of the Kings and Chronicles. These are stories of that period. And then for us, Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther fall under history. Ezra and Nehemiah talk about the rebuilding of the walls and of the temple and of Jerusalem after the exile. And Esther is sort of a standalone book, not just because she marries a Persian, but because there's no mention of God in this book. There is mention of of the Hebrews, but the Hebrews are under persecution during this during the time of the telling of Esther. And it is an answer to a trivia question. It's the only book that doesn't mention God in the entire Bible. And then you have poetry and wisdom. Those would be the things that you would expect: Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, which not very many people preach out of because that's a family hour, and Job, which is the oldest book in the Bible. It's a book that is meant in ancient language to try and understand why good people suffer. And so then you move to the major and minor prophets. And this is funny. There is no technical reason why some are major and some are minor, other than these are the longest 5, and the rest of these are all shorter than that. So these are all arranged by size. You'll see here, not even necessarily chronologically. Hosea, Joel is older than Hosea, but it's shorter, so it comes after Hosea. Obadiah is older than all of them, and but it's shorter, so it falls down here. See what I mean? So that's that's how the different kinds of writing are broken down in the Old Testament. Now, it's worth looking at some examples of those different kinds of writing. And so we're going to do a little bit of this. We'll see, we'll read through a few of these, and then forgive me while I get this slide set up. Here we go. Share screen. Here we go. Okay, so here's an example of the law. And it's funny, I didn't write the book down, but I'm pretty sure this is from Leviticus. Leviticus 2, starting in the first verse, says this: when anyone brings a grain offering to the Lord, their offering is to be of the finest flour. They're to pour olive oil on it, put incense on it, and take it to Aaron's sons, the priests. The priest will take a handful of the flour and oil together with the incense and burn it as a memorial portion on the altar. It's a food offering. It's meant to create an aroma pleasing to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the food offerings presented to the Lord. Now, the Torah, especially Leviticus, is filled with things like this. These are the laws and practices of the Hebrew people as they learned how to develop their own worship practices and liturgies even. So this is what you do. And actually it's in another part of the Old Testament where it talks about what sin requires you to offer a grain offering. So when you've committed that sin, or you just want to cover it to be careful, you bring this grain offering. But notice you take a handful out of it and you put perfume on the handful and burn it to God. The rest goes to the priests. This is how the priests were fed from the offerings of the people. And then, just because I have made a meal out of this in previous weeks, do you notice down here that it is a most holy part of the food offerings presented to the Lord in all capital letters? That means that in the original Hebrew, that was Yahweh. And so then we move on to the histories. The histories, Samuel and Kings, were written during the exile in about 560 or 550 BC. The Chronicles were written after the exile, about a century later. And it's a relatively familiar story that God is pleased with Solomon. And this is the story of where God grants Solomon wisdom. Many of you will know the phrase, the wisdom of Solomon, or he's as wise as Solomon, or she's as wise as Solomon. This is where that comes from. And this is how it appears in 2 Chronicles. Just want to read this last part. God said to Solomon, "Since this is your heart's desire, and you have not asked for wealth or possessions or honor, nor for the death of your enemies, and since you have not asked for a long life, but for wisdom and knowledge to govern my people over whom I've made you king, therefore wisdom and knowledge will be given you. And I will also give you wealth and possessions and honor such as no king who was ever before you ever had, or none after you will have." That's the way that story is told in Chronicles. But Kings is written before that. It's written as a way of understanding how the Hebrew people got sent into exile. But it's almost the same thing. The Lord was pleased that Solomon asked for this. And so God said to him, "Since you have asked for this and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings." There's a small difference in these. In the earlier one, that's written in the context of the exile and God's people trying to grasp the fact that the God who gave them identity has now punished them. God says to Solomon, "I will do what you have asked. I'll make you wise so that there will never have been anyone like you." in the later one, when they're coming back and they've been blessed to be able to come back into their home country, and I will give you wealth, possessions, and honor, such as no king who has ever had before you ever had, and none after you will have. There's a subtle difference there. In the older one, you'll be wise like no other king. In the newer one, you'll be rich like no other king. So they tell the stories. It's the same story, same king, same blessing from God being given to Solomon. But there are these subtle differences based on the situation of the Hebrew people as they write this down and experience it. Some of these I won't do too much, but poetry, we read a lot of the poetry in worship because the Psalms are basically the Hebrew hymnal. They are the language that God's people used over time to worship God and to express their joy and their praise, but also their problems. There are different kinds of psalms, and later on we may dabble back into this, but there are psalms about God as king. There are psalms that are celebrations that are happening within the kingdom on earth. But there are these kinds of psalms called lament psalms, and laments in the Bible are just like they sound. They are complaints. And there are laments on behalf of the entire community, and there are laments on behalf of individuals. Now, here's what I love. If you combine the corporate lament psalms and the individual lament psalms, there are more lament psalms than any other kind of psalm in the Bible. And what that tells me is that more often than not, when the Hebrew people sat down to write their worship language, what came out was a complaint. I find that comforting. I find that as a validation of my own sense of God, what's going on? Why do you feel so far off? The same language that's in the Psalms is language that all of us pray from time to time, whether we know it or not. God, what's going on? There was a tragic event in Thailand overnight, just an obscene act of violence against children in Thailand, just today. But my first response was, God, what is going on? And we find that language deeply rooted in so many of the Psalms. And so the Psalms are the heart of Hebrew poetry and worship language. Let me just find something that I need to look at just for a moment. We lump together poetry and wisdom, but I really like to talk about wisdom literature on its own because we don't talk about the wisdom literature nearly enough. The wisdom writings, these were the writings that helped the people of God live their faith out daily. It's the wisdom literature that helped them put language on being human beings who worshiped a God that they couldn't see. Some of it is ethics, but also a lot of it is just everyday wise teachings for the purpose of having happy lives. You've read through some of the Proverbs before and how they're just practical teaching for how to interact with other people. Oftentimes they're things like, the foolish man speaks first, but the wise person holds their tongue. Or there are all kinds of things that you look at that made it into the Bible. That little piece of practical teaching, but the wisdom literature guided Hebrew life for centuries and continues to do so. And it's in our Bible too. And so the wisdom literature is very valuable for us to read. The other, for me, principal part of the wisdom literature is the book of Ecclesiastes, which we also don't read enough. Ecclesiastes is the lament of a preacher leader. There's some belief that maybe Solomon, in all of his wisdom toward the end of his life, wrote Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes oftentimes sounds like one long complaint. But what it is a eyes wide open look at the world as it really is. And so he makes observations like the rain falls on the evil and the just, or good things happen to bad people. What are we supposed to make of that? But oftentimes you hear this complaint in Ecclesiastes, and then the speaker steps back and says, but we know that God is sovereign, to use our modern language. We know that God is there, that God remains in control, even though these things happen that we can't understand. For those of you who were introduced to Ecclesiastes 3 by the Byrds or Bob Dylan, think about the wisdom in that passage. To everything there is a season, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to fight, a time to make peace. And it is a non-idealistic way of looking at human life as a person of faith. Ecclesiastes often is, I think, one of the more underused books that we have in our Bible, and I think it's a very it's worth your read. I used to talk to a couple of guys who were Christian filmmakers, and they would say that the Christ story used to be the central story of most films, right? Hero comes out of nowhere, saves the town, but often dies in the end, but leaves a lasting impact that helps them live differently afterwards. That's like the generic version of the Jesus story. But these guys were talking about how there was a shift in fiction writing and in filmmaking to where the feeling of Ecclesiastes, of trying to understand life when it looks meaningless, trying to understand what could possibly be good when all the great stuff happens to bad people and good people suffer. And so there has been this shift over the last 30, 40 years or so in the way that stories are told. Sacrificial stories are still out there, but oftentimes, especially in independent films, you will see more of this questioning of, like, is there any meaning to life at all? Which is, oddly enough, a direct quote from Ecclesiastes. Meaningless, meaningless. That's how he starts his story. Everything is meaningless. And so the wisdom literature is a really important part of our biblical record. And I take it to heart that we have not looked at it probably enough. And so maybe that's another opportunity for an evening series or even a message series. Ecclesiastes gets at the heart of what most of us experience in real life, which is a little bit of confusion, a little bit of pain, some grief, punctuated by moments of joy and connection. And that is human life as described by the preacher. That's the character that's doing the talking, the preacher in Ecclesiastes. And so the last section of Old Testament writing is the prophets. And I left, we'll probably do less there because we've done a lot in this Thursday night slot certainly on Amos, and talked about some of the other prophets. But the prophets were people within the inner circle, most of the time. We have some exceptions, but people within the inner circle who were called to speak the truth to the people when God in his invisibility was not getting through. And so God spoke through prophets, and the prophets, more often than not, were bearers of bad news. It's not always true, but it's often true. I would even say it's mostly true. The prophets would come and say, turn back to God, turn back to the covenants that you can read in your own Torah. Go back to the law, the way that God invited you to follow it, and then promised you all these blessings. Because if you don't follow the law, God's going to take these blessings back. That is that's the sort of ebb and flow of the prophetic writings all the way through that section of the Old Testament. We spent a lot of time last year in Amos. And remember, Amos was somebody from the southern kingdom who was called into the northern kingdom to tell them they were doing it wrong. And remember, he told them that, yes, your neighbors are sinful, but God cares more about your behavior than these other people. And promised them punishment. And what we know, if we join the two classes together, we know that the people that Amos spoke to were the first ones carried off into exile by the Assyrians. And so the prophetic literature is a way of God speaking through a person to his people, oftentimes to give them some of their last dire warnings of to turn back to him before the punishment came. The big punishments are the two exiles. And so with those major categories of writing in our minds, there's one kind of writing that appears in both testaments, like a little subcategory that's very important for us. And I think it's very important for us as we experience the Christian faith in our own culture. And this is where we get to a technical term called apocalyptic. Now, that's a word that you might hear. It's a word we might use. Has a very specific meaning in biblical studies. And for this, I'll start with a joke. Group of seminary students are playing basketball at the local Y, and they're talking about the latest theories about Revelation and how to understand it. And they're going back and forth about who's what and when this is going to happen and what the sequence is. And the janitor is pushing his broom over on the side and just sort of shaking his head and laughing. And they notice that, and so they call him over and they say, "Hey, do you have something to contribute to our discussion of Revelation?" And he says, "Yeah, Jesus is going to win." Folks, that I've heard that joke more times over the last 30 or 40 years. That is a perfect description of apocalyptic. God wins in the end. Whatever else happens in the beginning and middle of an apocalyptic story, God wins in the end. And that's the point of the story. Apocalyptic writing developed, as you might imagine, during the exile. It's a way to account for the catastrophe of being God's people, but also being conquered and taken off into captivity. The two central themes of apocalyptic literature are national sin that brings about destruction and God's ultimate victory in the end. Now, again, you may be thinking this is not crucial for our understanding of the Bible, but folks, it's in the Old and New Testament, it is the apocalyptic literature that has the loudest volume in the culture. If you've read the Left Behind books, or if you know somebody who has, that's where that comes from. It comes from the apocalyptic view of the Bible. Apocalypse is Greek for revelation, which ought to tip you off to where we're going to head down the road. The literature usually has a vision with an angel revealing, right? Revelation, revealing something about the spiritual world that will impact the physical world. One of my pastors years ago referred to apocalyptic literature as describing the unseen reality of the present. The unseen reality of the present. Now, if you look through apocalyptic literature, there's oftentimes dragons or beasts or all kinds of creatures that are there, and there's this big battle back and forth, and God's people have this happen to them, but then they come back and win in the end. Those stories were meant to be comforting to people who were suffering. In the Old Testament, it's people who were suffering in exile. In the New Testament, it's people who were suffering under Roman persecution. So one writer said this, he said, the object of apocalyptic literature in general was to reconcile the righteousness of God with the suffering condition of his righteous servants on earth. Now, I would add to that oftentimes the suffering that is inflicted on the people in the scriptures is because they weren't righteous. But that's what it is. Apocalyptic literature is what you write when you can't see with your own eyes how everything is going to be resolved, how it seems like the world is getting worse and worse and worse and worse. So we're going to try and create a story that reminds us of what? God wins in the end. God's going to win. Apocalyptic literature rises out of times of crisis, exile, military defeat, occupation, and persecutions. When things get really awful, apocalyptic literature tries to make sense of it all. And it's meant to be a reminder and reassurance that God will win in the end. It is not meant to be read for its predictive details. All of what I've been saying in the second half of tonight points to that sentence. Apocalyptic literature is not supposed to be read for all of the details that describe the sequence of things that are going to happen toward the end. They're meant to communicate the big story that God wins in the end. And that's meant to be a comfort to people who are suffering. Please tell me that part makes sense, because that's Revelation and the Old Testament apocalyptic literature, primarily in Daniel. Those have been read so badly for so long that they're burned into Christian culture, primarily in this country. We've got folks in certain traditions saying, oh, the world is going to hell in a handbasket, but God's going to burn it all in the end so that we can all survive. That's apocalyptic literature, but it's not meant to be predictive prophecy. So just as we wind up tonight, the best examples of apocalyptic literature are Daniel in the Old Testament and Revelation in the New Testament. But there are sections of apocalyptic in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Joel and Zechariah. And in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 24 is in many ways a chapter of Jesus' teaching toward the end of his ministry that is rooted in apocalyptic literature. The parable of the sheep and the goats. Now, if I remember going to a Bible study at camp when I was a kid where they told me there were really going to be sheep and really going to be goats and really going to be a lake of fire, rather than the point of saying, be one of the people who follows God. Mark 13 has some, anyway, there's a bunch of, we may look at these to start next week. But apocalyptic literature is a major thread through the Old and New Testaments. But it has just like those sections of a newspaper, you're supposed to read apocalyptic literature for a particular purpose. And it's to give you comfort in a time of crisis and to assure you that God wins in the end. It's not meant for us to start looking for 8-winged dragons as a tip-off that Jesus is coming back. All right, that's dangerously close to being on a high horse here, so I'm going to stop. You can unmute. If you are unmuted and you have noise in the background, just mute yourself and until you want to ask something. But so all of that really was leading to that riff about apocalyptic literature. But what questions do you have? Yeah, Steve.
So until you put up this new chart as opposed to the older one that I photographed when it was up from before. I was going to ask about how the law was organized, but it looks like those 5 books, the Torah, really are the oldest ones. Is that true?
I think Job is probably the oldest individual piece of writing in the Old Testament. There's all kinds of, I mean, it's hard to say because they all come through, they all are part of that oral tradition that moves into the time when things are written down and then translated into 2 languages, Greek and Hebrew. And so it's hard to say which one is oldest, but the stories in the Torah, meaning the stories in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, those have their roots in the oldest literature that's in the Bible, which is why they're so hard to understand, which is why nobody preaches about the Nephilim and the giants in the land and how they came and had kids with human parents who existed apart from Adam and Eve. You know, I stay out of the first 11 chapters of Genesis most of the time. I got in trouble one time for saying that the part of the Bible that matters starts at Genesis 12.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm really saying is the part of the Bible that I come closest to understanding starts in Genesis 12. That's really what that means. Anna, you have your little cartoon hand up.
Yeah, it's a really cute little hand. I want to thank you so much for talking about apocalyptic literature. That really hit home for me tonight, because I used to worry about all the, horrifying things discussed in a lot, and I would get all worried and like, wait a minute, God is good. God wants the best for us. What's all this chaos stuff, right? So I'd love to hear you talk more or rant more about apocalyptic literature in the future. And the fact that, we can go through tough things. Like I went through a challenge recently, but I've come out better. And I account that to God. So that's really relevant for me. I mean, nowhere near a crisis. I mean, not a crisis like the apocalypse, but, just really tough stuff, like we all go through. So thank you very much.
It is the absolute #1 issue that pastors talk about with church members and our communities is, where is God in our suffering? Sometimes people don't even say it in those words, but that's what I hear. That's really what I've been good. Why did this happen to me? Why can't I have a relationship with my child or my spouse? Or, I mean, when we come across brokenness, and I think this is built into us as people of faith, part of our response is, well, where's God in that? And the apocalyptic literature is that question writ huge. We'll start with some of that next week too, and then work our way through some passages before we make the shift into the 3 centuries in between the last Old Testament passage and the coming of Jesus. There's a long, quiet period in there that's worth talking about, especially if you've ever celebrated Hanukkah, right? Because I think that story comes in there. Charlotte?
The very conservative churches use Revelation, and they don't talk about in the end God wins. It's building in the fear of what happens to people. And I think that's really, really hard for those, myself coming from a very conservative Baptist church and listening to, if you do this and this and this kind of thing. I've never heard your phraseology that in the end God wins. That doesn't come through in what you hear with the conservative churches.
Yeah, and I would say, and I want to say this sort of humbly and with a fair amount of fear and trembling, that that I think the issue is reading a certain kind of literature and trying to draw from it information that it wasn't meant to communicate. This is why I tell that lame story about the newspaper every time we get into a sequence like this, that you would never try and find the Dodger score in the classifieds. We shouldn't be trying to find the sequence or trying to discern the sequence of the end times in a kind of literature that was meant to comfort us in our suffering and tell us that God wins in the end. It's no less true. It's just telling a different truth, not an alternate truth. These are not alternate facts. It is a different facet of the truth, which is sometimes you just got to know how it's going to end. Is it Billy Crystal in When Harry Met Sally, who when he reads a book always reads the end first because he doesn't like the suspense of Revelation and Daniel and the other little pockets of apocalyptic literature in the Bible, they're meant to show us what happens in the end. Now, it takes some work to wade through all the creatures and tumult and wars and all this, but I do go back to what the pastor told me, which was that it's the unseen reality of the present. That sometimes those of us who grew up in our scientific age and in this culture, we have a hard time remembering that there's something invisible happening out there. I mean, if we believe in God, then we believe something invisible is happening out there. One interpretation is that there is this ongoing battle between good and evil that is unseen to us and which God will win in the end, but is still happening. Now, I don't know. I'm a historian, so I deal in things that have documents or eyewitnesses and things, but that's the part of the faith that we have to leave ourselves a little open to. And I think it's the part that we experience a little when we read the apocalyptic passages correctly. We get a glimpse into what that unseen reality of the present might be like. Yes, Jack, please.
Yeah, I think this is your best lecture so far, and they've all been outstanding. So I clap and cheer. I was just going to say about the prophets, Bernard Anderson, I've been reviewing his book on understanding the Old Testament, and he said that the role of the prophets was a check on the kings, because the people wanted to have a king, but I think Nathan and others said, no, you don't need a king because Yahweh's the king.
Yeah.
But so the prophets come along as a check on the kings.
Yeah.
Along the lines that you were talking about.
And isn't that wise of God? I mean, we know that I forget, is Edmund Burke, somebody's going to correct me on who quoted this, that said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
The prophets are meant to be a check on that absolute power. King David could have anybody executed that he wants. That's an enormous burden of absolute power. And when he strayed, it was a prophet who called him up in front of the entire court and humiliated him. Now, David could have killed the prophet, but I doubt if David would be in such an exalted position now if he had killed Nathan in response to Nathan's challenge to him. David sees a woman he wants, he takes her, then he has her husband killed, then he ends up marrying her. He would have gotten away with it if Nathan hadn't said, hey, one of your people saw a cow that they wanted and went and took the cow and then killed the owner of the cow. And David raged at this guy until Nathan said, that's you.
Yeah.
So that's exactly right, Jack. That's a great line to use, that the prophets are a check on the power of the king in a theocracy. And the monarchy in Israel doesn't last all that long. You have Saul, you have David, you have Solomon, and then the wheels come off.
And also, you said to read Peter Enns' book on on the Bible. Well, he makes a point. First and Second Kings and First and Second Samuel, you get into what you just said. Well, you get to Chronicles, doesn't even mention about the sin of Bathsheba. No, because it whitewashes everything because
Yeah.
it was written later.
Right. Another principle of biblical archaeology is if you find something that is awkward or sounds overly angry or is somehow sticks out in its tone, it's probably the original.
Yeah.
Because over time, the copyists would have smoothed off those hard edges.
There you go.
And so the seminary line is, you're always looking for the more difficult reading. And the older you get, sometimes the more you find these hard-edged readings that gentle monks over time said, oh, we can't say that. That can't really mean that. All right, we're 5 minutes over time. Sorry for going long today. I wanted to get to the apocalyptic part, and I'll trim back the review next week, and we'll glide into more of this. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for thank you for the assurance that whatever it means, that somehow you're going to be victorious in the end. We long for that and hope for that in whatever shape that is going to happen. But we ask that as we roll around and reflect and are challenged by these passages, that you would remind us that you're sovereign, that you have your hand on the end, whatever that might be, and that we trust you that end would be transforming and a blessing for every single person on earth. We pray this tonight in the name of your Son, who made it all possible. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you,
John.
John. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll see you next week. I'll be
Safe
gone Sunday.
travels.
Thank you.
Safe travels.
Thanks.
Fantastic.